There are no passengers on Spaceship Earth. We are all crew. Marshall McLuhan.
Hey folks, I'm Gale Huxley.
I'm Rick Chambers.
Welcome to Book Sense. We view the world through perceptual lenses. You carry many of them with you now. Your common sense, your culture. On Book Sense, we talk about all aspects of life, history, and society through the lens of stories. So choose your tool, a lens or a spyglass. Use it to break through soil until you feel fresh air. And join us.
Today's quote is from Marshall McLuhan. He was, how would you describe him? A philosopher is the best term for him. He was really active during the 1960s and 1970s. He died December 31st, 1980. He was born Herbert Marshall McLuhan in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, July 21st, 1911. And he coined, you might have heard of him if you've heard the terms global village and the medium is the message, because he coined those terms. And my connection to him is that when I was taking writing and new media at Savannah College of Art and Design, I had to read an essay called The Medium is the Message. And for me, that was the most memorable thing I probably read all throughout college, because I had never thought of every type of media affecting us more than the content that comes out of the media. How did you know about Marshall McLuhan? Or what's your connection?
The only things I knew about him was that he coined the term global village and the medium is the message.
Mm-hmm.
That somehow even though I always have my nose in a book,
Mm-hmm.
we've talked about authors that I have never read so far. So,
Yeah, and honestly, I've only read that essay. I actually have his book Understanding Media on my night table, and I've been avoiding it for about a year, just staring at it because it's heavy stuff.
yes.
But it's accessible in chunks.
And it is this combination. I have looked him up on Wikipedia, and it is this combination of being really, really accessible and really, really difficult to understand, it seems.
Yeah.
And to kind of there weren't a lot of famous philosophers or people that are just known for kind of coining a word, but there is this recognition. It was as time went on, the accuracy of these words seem to get better and better, or everyone senses there's something really important here. It's just hard to put my finger on what it is.
Well, he was controversial, apparently, when I was reading him. And
Yes.
he coined the term global village, which is how a lot of people describe the internet 30 years before the internet,
Yes.
really. And he died in 1980. I mean, what was his technology like then? Probably nothing like how you describe global village. There wasn't any.
Yes. And so the word that's used for him most often is visionary. And
Yeah.
we'll get more into visionary later in the podcast. But there may be no other word for someone who seems to be able to see like a social trend or the implications of something before anyone else sees it. And the really nice thing about an author, though, is they can point it out, and then when you look for it, you can see it.
Mm-hmm.
If this word had not been coined, there might be aspects of the internet that people wouldn't be able to perceive in the same way.
Yes. Or there would have been a different wording, but it was just spot on there. And I didn't even know, because I assumed that he was like a sociologist or, I don't know,
Yes.
or something, some sort of scientist. And he has his degree or had his degree in English, and he taught English at several U.S. and Canadian universities. Something that I think was interesting, which really puts him in line with book sense, is, there was a part in his biography where they said he turned away from religion to literature to gratify his soul's hunger for truth and beauty.
So he's a romantic.
Yes. And when I think of somebody that, he's affected, like, media, or like media theory.
So yeah,
Like,
he's a media guru would have been the
yeah,
term back
media
in.
guru. Now I associate that with, like, specifically with technology, or,
Yes,
or Silicon
yes.
Valley or something. But I think, like you
Here's a
said,
person with an interest in theology at first, in literature, and he
but
was involved with traditional religion, then broke away, then re-involved with a different faith tradition. Well,
yeah,
both were Christian, but he went from like Protestant to Catholic.
yeah, from raised by a Baptist mother and a Methodist father, then he converted to Roman Catholicism, and remained there all of his life. But he didn't speak about it much. It's not what was influencing overtly his theories.
Yes. This person that seems to have come from a non-technological background makes such an accurate prediction about something that was eventually seen to be really technologically based. But maybe his insight, I think one of his books, The Gutenberg Galaxy,
Mm-hmm.
he saw printing as this technological revolution. And everybody kind of knows that as a fact. They can even know when printing began. But he seemed to suggest it changed things in ways nobody had ever looked at. It changed our very consciousness.
Yes. And I think, too, I mean, the only way he could have been so forward thinking was by looking so far back into media. And
Excellent.
a common, like, fallacy, I would say now, is that you have to just be forward thinking. You can't look back to progress.
The latest thing, the latest thing.
Yeah, you can't be looking back or reminiscing on the past to move forward. And in some aspects, that's true. But you can't ever leave that knowledge by, like, that you have to have that knowledge to see what the trends, because as we've covered before, history is cyclical. We were talking about that last week.
Right.
And yeah, so, and I mentioned, I think people are pretty familiar with Global Village, but media as the message, I don't think is as clear or as commonly used as Global Village.
And I believe you ran across it in it more than I did because of your education in the arts. People that actually work with media.
Yeah, and this class was called Writing and New Media. That I had to take 2 classes at SCAD to graduate, and it was all about, like, untraditional forms of, like, to be a writer now. It's nothing like it was years ago. It's always transforming. There's always going to be a place for a writer, but it has to evolve. We were figuring out how to do interactive writing in games, or, so yeah, I think I was so drawn to the medium as the message, because there's a lot of talk about how social media, how, like, using the computer and screen so much affects our behavior.
Yes. So can you imagine teaching a class today and saying, okay, we're really going to understand the implications of the printing press? It wouldn't seem very relevant, and yet it was important. I like your insight that, like, it's not always the latest thing. If you want to be a visionary, you sometimes the further back you look, the more you can tell what a trajectory is, or
Yeah. And an example of this, I'm going to read a little passage from, because there's a summary on Wikipedia of the medium is the message, which I almost, like, every time I have something in from Wikipedia, I recoil, because in college, you're never allowed to use or cite Wikipedia, but there's some really great stuff on there. But there's this example I remember from the essay where he was talking about how people would he used Abraham Lincoln speeches. That's what people would do as a pastime. They would sit there for like 6 hours, for hours, listening to his speech. And it wasn't about so much the content, the message. It was what it created in people, the pastime that it allowed people. So here it says, McLuhan's insight was that a medium affects the society in which plays a role not by the content delivered over the medium, but by the characteristics of the medium itself. McLuhan pointed to the light bulb as a clear demonstration of this concept. A light bulb does not have content in the way that a newspaper has articles or television has programs, yet it is a medium that has a social effect. That is, a light bulb enables people to create space during nighttime that would otherwise be enveloped by darkness.
So now we're going to talk about cutting edge stuff with the pream press and the light bulb. But it is understanding these differences that it changes the world in ways that aren't obvious, and it changes not the world, it changes our consciousness and the way we interact with people in some really unpredictable ways, and creates an actual new situation. You mentioned Wikipedia. I really like Wikipedia. You know, my approach is oral tradition, and with the medium is the message. I've always thought, like, so if your medium is oral tradition, what's the message that's just contained in wanting to stay in the oral world? But Wikipedia operates the closest to the oral tradition or oral world as anything currently. It changes. It's not controlled by academia, and yet academia is there, and yet it is the fastest place to go to get kind of common knowledge today.
Yeah. And that's the first thing that shows up usually. It has such a good summary. I
Yes,
think you can be pointed in the right direction.
right?
Whereas if you don't know about something, you don't know where to start.
Yes. So I've been kind of talking with people for so long. You will see these changes in language, like awesome, or as our oral language changes through time, there'll be a new phrase or a new way of saying things, and then it will fall out. But people generally, oral language, nobody owns it, nobody controls it. It operates very similar to the way Wikipedia operates.
No?
And you end up with, what you really end up with is good enough language. And that's really important, because in our everyday lives, all you need is good enough language.
Um, and language has changed so much, like so fast now that you can find it
Right.
anywhere. Like
YouTube
slang.
made like influencers or trendsetters official in a way, but within oral language, how does like the whole language of a culture change?
Yeah.
Someone says something in a way that other people that's so intuitive that other people adopt,
Mhm.
and nobody controls it or owns it.
But there is such a resistance, I think, with any sort of change in language, like text language or something, for example, or slang. I was so resistant to it. And my friends, like at the beginning of college,
Hmm.
we were very against it, and we would just try to talk as properly as possible.
Yes.
And then one of my friends that felt the same way I did, she said, "Wait, I think I'm wrong. I think that language evolves, and we just have to accept it, and this is okay. This is all how,
Right.
like, now everyone can express themselves, and we
Right.
have to be accepting of that." And it took me a little bit longer, but I'm there now. But I'm still not going to use language that doesn't feel comfortable in my mouth.
Excellent. And I'm glad you said that, because on here I've butchered words, I've butchered people's names. That's not intentional. I'm doing the best I can. But there is this idea of like either being proper or correct, and like how to find a balance between that, and like being shoddy or sloppy with things, or not, because
Yeah.
language can be very beautiful too.
So as you were saying, like being proper or shoddy, there's a celebrity that's coming out with a book of like poetry. Name's Bella Thorne, and she is like, dyslexic, and that affects her typing and stuff. And she doesn't have an editor for her book, so all of her mistakes are in the book.
Yes.
And I was thinking at first, that's not new. It's just you being lazy. But then I took a step back from that. I was like, okay, wait, that's not right either. But I still haven't come to a conclusion. Should we polish ourselves? Or about the future? Like not correcting your typos, not having
Right.
an editor, just raw you to your audience.
So far, our mistakes have been like live
Yes.
and included. Um, that's just where we are right now. But I did want to kind of address it, that there's no disrespect meant in that. And
Yeah.
there's pressure today, like with names, to not
Yeah.
get a name exactly
It's
right.
expected to do your research, and you do your
Yes,
research, but it's still, slip up or have a hard time pronouncing something that you're not familiar with.
yes. And so maybe what you and I are dealing with is there's this pressure to there's a lot that we want to explore. And if we spend all of our time perfecting everything and making a perfect show, we'll never get to all the things we want to explore.
I mean, that's one of the biggest issues of my life. I want to feel ready. I don't want to make a mistake. And so thus far, I have created absolutely nothing. Because, like, how do you know when you're really ready and polished? You can spend so much time on something. For example, I wrote this article, spent 12 hours on something that wasn't very long, read it out loud to my husband, and over it went back. First few sentences, there was a typo. There's always going to be something.
So there's this phrase I like to say. When someone asks me why I'm doing something, I'll say, we'll find out. And even with the approach to this show, it may take some time before we find out why we're doing this. But the idea is to explore this idea of book sense.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to move forward with that as much as we can. So for today, getting back to he's famous for a couple of Global Village and Medium is the Message. But the quote you picked is, there are no passengers on Spaceship Earth. We are all crew, for this visionary. And so here he's probably writing in the 60s.
Yeah, I didn't find the origin of this quote when I was
Yes.
searching.
And yet you resonated to it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, first, to talk a little bit about, like, where Spaceship Earth came from. I got kind of stuck on that.
Excellent.
It wasn't McLuhan that coined that. That was Robert Buckminster Fuller, which you were familiar with, but I wasn't. He coined the term, and a quote from him is, we live on this spaceship Earth but do not have an operating manual. And in several decades, humanity would approach a fork in the road, utopia or oblivion. And every day feels like that somewhat. I really connected with that because the first thing this made me think of, this quote has been taken on by environmental activists. And it makes me think of, like, social activism, which I have had no part in so far in my life. And I feel ashamed of that now, recently.
Yes. Yes, and so in the 60s, what was beginning to happen, technology was beginning to appear as more and more important. So with this quote, you kind of have, there's the natural earth, or the earth seen as living and organic. And now there was this obsession with space beginning in the 50s and then into the 60s. There was a period of an obsession with space travel, going into space, at the very time when computers were, like, the technology was enabling it. And so this idea of kind of being at the crossroads of utopia or oblivion, is that what technology kind of put us at? I don't think in the rural agricultural world you felt like you were always at the crossroads of utopia or oblivion.
I mean, watch any sci-fi movie and that's kind of the message, and it's usually never utopia. I see it's always destruction, or not utopia, but a dystopia. I mean, we're just coming out of the phase where almost every young adult novel was a dystopia.
Yes.
Because we don't need fiction now to imagine it.
Yes. So maybe what we're trying to do is get a handle on the role technology is going to play in our life. Are we controlling it? Is it controlling us? Like, kind of, where is our relationship or our pushing of technology going to take us? And so, in a way, they're using Spaceship Earth. It's this idea, like, no user's manual, and there are no passengers. We're all crew. It sounds very intentional, like an emphasis on the technological aspect of humanity,
Yes.
which would have been totally new at the time.
Yeah. And you're making a really good point about, like, when the spaceship breaks down into space, like, that's what are you going to do?
Right.
That's the worst thing that could happen. If something happens to Earth, what
Yes.
are we going to do?
In some larger narratives, especially in The Passion of the Western Mind, there's a very good section that kind of points out in a lot of ways, beginning in the 70s, there was the gas shortage, the OPEC crisis, energy crisis. We began to really, really realize that resources are limited. At that time, it was like there were no new oil fields to explore, or kind of there was just this sense of being limited. And you put that with technology, and it's trying to realize that this earth that seems so bounteous and has lasted so long, but it's trying to help people realize you're in an environment of limited resources, and if those resources aren't there, you're really, really in trouble. So there wasn't global or climate change. Ecology was just beginning to become an issue, but these visionary thinkers were trying to use a metaphor to get people some urgency behind the idea of we could be headed toward utopia or oblivion.
I wonder, though, you said it seems like he had in mind technology. This has been commandeered by environmentalists, this quote, and I wonder...
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, and honestly, when I looked at this, that's why I was drawn to it. I thought I didn't even think about like technology so much. I kind of ignored Spaceship Earth. I immediately thought about climate change and environmentalism, because you're saying that people think the Earth is so bountiful and everything. I'm always looking, through when I'm looking through like social or environmental activists on social media or anything. Or if I'm looking at the news, especially the news, or climate change reports, it's terrifying. Like, they say that we have 12 years to change the course of, like, we have to start using renewable energy, or there's going to be catastrophic climate change, or by 2050, there might not be life on Earth, or people will start dying. That's so soon.
So in a way, they're kind of playing with our mind. Like, kind of, if I say spaceship and crew, how many people do you imagine?
Not so many. Like, not 7 billion.
Max of 20.
Yeah.
Maybe. Or Star Trek, even.
Yeah.
But
Star
a very
Wars, there's
limited...
a lot, but
yeah. And so a crew of 7 to 8 billion. Or you've got to save Spaceship Earth as an individual. That's completely overwhelming.
It's daunting. And I said I felt ashamed, and that's because it was so overwhelming. It's kind of the same like argument that's been coming up with voting, or the problem that people feel like they don't have a voice, so they don't vote. I wasn't contributing to things that even I believe strongly in, because I believed I didn't have a voice, or I was worried about something being controversial. I'm always worried about outside opinions. It seems so futile sometimes for it, because although there have been, I mentioned before we started recording, a 16-year-old Greta Thunberg, I know I'm saying that wrong, a Swedish activist. She has inspired climate change protests all over the world with youth.
Yes.
With youth mainly, that she's inspiring.
Yes.
And
you mentioned like watching her TED Talks, and there are these amazing people.
Oh, and she's incredible to watch. There's weight in like her presence. You take her seriously, this like tiny little blonde girl, but she's scared. That's the reason why I started thinking about my own actions, because she said, and I'm misquoting this probably, but she said, I don't want your hopes and or thoughts and prayers, your hopes and like wishes. I want you to panic. I want you to feel like your house is on fire, because it is. And that's what got me thinking. Yes. And then this was after I read Parkland, where they're talking about gun like control and gun laws, and I was thinking, well, I really feel inspired by this, yet what am I doing? Yes. It is overwhelming.
Right.
Because it feels like, even though there's millions of people all over the world, say, protesting for climate change, what has happened? Like, what is happening? it's the few that seem to have the power.
Yes.
It's like, who's the captain on this crew, and should he be overthrown?
And maybe the quote even suggests there is no captain. So there's no user's manual and there's no captain. Everybody's crew. And so, and then sometimes it's this type of roller coaster where I'll see an incredible speaker and there's this inspiration, there's even this like kind of wanting to contribute in some way. And then there's this despair and shame at doing nothing. But that's part of the cycle or
Yeah, and I think there's also, I noticed, especially with environmentalism and climate change, like, we recycle, but now I'm looking at all my habits closely, all the plastic. I drive a Jeep, and,
right,
and
right.
thinking, well, this is also somewhat selfish. I'm going to have to make, like, my life, it's easy to go out and buy some water bottles, or, you forget your bag at the store, get all these plastic bags. It makes life seemingly harder because the more harmful way of living is easier. And so, like, honestly, it is kind of selfish for
Right.
me, the reason
And
why
then
I've
there's
changed.
guilt
Yeah.
or mixed feelings about it, about everything.
Yeah. I mean, with
Um,
things, like, some things are black and white, but there's no
yes,
mixed feelings, but there's a ton of guilt.
yes, yes. Last week it was something similar with like telling people to follow their dreams. And um, there was this kind of backlash and debate about, well, you can do that, I can't afford to.
Yeah, because to follow your
It's
dreams is a privilege for 'cause who has the money or the no responsibility.
right. So this backlash between, or this ambivalence between getting inspired, wanting to contribute, then feeling helpless and overwhelmed,
Mm-hmm.
inspired and wanting to contribute, helpless and overwhelmed,
Yeah.
and then ashamed or guilty.
Yeah. And then I was reading, I don't mean to go too far back,
Yes,
but the second part of this Wikipedia summary of the medium as the messages says more controversially, he postulated that content had little effect on society. In other words, it did not matter if television broadcast children's shows or violent programming. And I was thinking, well, that's dispiriting, especially as a writer.
excellent. However, I began my career with Department of Family and Children Services, so I've worked in like therapy, counseling, social work for now close to like 40 years.
Mm.
Um, what did you just say? Like,
All right, so
oh,
it's
the content doesn't matter. Yes,
it's the way it's delivered.
we had the war on drugs, war on poverty, war on crime, war on violence, teen pregnancy. Those things made some difference. It made a difference. And yet the only weapon or like was information. And I have this little saying, information is ever only 20% of social change.
Mm-hmm.
Information is not really going to change, or content is not really going to create a movement. We kind of think like, well, let's just show the facts.
Yeah.
But then people debate on what the facts are, what is information.
Well, or it inspires the wrong movement. You mentioned the war on drugs. And I was reading, right now I'm reading the new Jim Crow, and it's talking about the war on drugs and how it disproportionately was aimed at black men.
Yes.
So it did inspire a movement, but
Right.
not a good movement,
Right.
and not one that is the mainstream story.
Yes. So there's another writer, though, that I like a lot, Marshall Rosenberg, that created this term nonviolent communication,
Mm-hmm.
and Rhea Eisler, that's a feminist writer. And they both kind of focused on why are we using a war metaphor for all of our social work. So the whole a war on this and this and this, businesses use, like kind of it's a war. And by using those metaphors, Spaceship Earth.
Yeah. Well, as you were saying that, I had to read in writing a new media class a book called Story Wars, all
Excellent.
about marketing, and
Yes,
the best
yes,
story is
yes,
that's the company that wins. Who has the best marketing story?
yes. There's a history. So Buckminster Fuller coined Spaceship Earth, and then McLuhan had this quote about it. And then a little while later, you started noticing, involved with the environmental movement, think global, act local.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was on Wiser Earth, around the time of Occupy, there was a really not famous writer. It was someone who just posted that called themselves Sustainable Dave.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, in the postmodern world, or in the current world, it's no longer think global, act local. It's think on every scale, act in every location.
You know, I didn't think about this when you mentioned it earlier, but that seems to be the theme. I mean, that is postmodern thinking is
Yes,
complexity.
and this writer
Complexity.
probably didn't say postmodern, but I've
Uh-huh.
adopted that, and as that, there's the key to maybe this despair that people are feeling. I can't do anything on the global scale. This, what we're beginning to realize is there's scale, or what we've lost perspective of is the idea of scale. Um, I'm really for like local, small, living on, I call it human pace, human scale. About 150 people are all the people and it's even called Dunbar's number. It's kind of the number of people you can actually relate to.
But also that global scale is somewhat necessary and important. How else, like, now we can reach out to other cultures, see what other cultures
Excellent,
are doing, or like what's happening right now. Not in the
right?
newspaper a few weeks from now, or not in history books.
Yes. So there's some writers, and I'm not sure who, they call it glocal.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're beginning to do is how do we operate on both the global scale, the local scale, and everything in between.
Yeah. And this relates to how people talk about having our culture, and then there's other people that say, you know, we're all one, or whatever. And
Right?
that's, um, obviously, I think that culture is important, and color blindness is silly, but, uh, and to some extent, shouldn't be one or the other. You can have culture, your local community, but also a global scale. It doesn't have to be
Also be aware
choice.
of global issues, global scale, like at the same time.
Yeah.
And so I think you're getting right at this is what everyone is struggling with.
Yeah. Well, I think too, it is too broad for environmentalism. We were talking about that, and I was talking about how, you know, recycling I'm doing, but there's so many other things I'm not doing right. And when I look up like solutions for how to
Right?
live sustainably, it's always the same type of person. And I was thinking, poor people are people that, you know, don't have a lot of means. They don't really have a choice to live 100% sustainably. You have to get, like, at the store, it's cheaper to get all the plastic water bottles,
Yes.
or, you know, to all the,
It's kind of a privilege to live, or you have to be
yeah,
privileged.
it's expensive to shop at Whole Foods,
Yes.
you know, but also, like, poor people they're the victims, while it's strange. It's like, while it's the rich people who are doing the most damage. I was reading a report that said it's usually white people that are putting out the most pollution, while it's the minorities suffering.
At the same
Communities.
time, that's, yes, exactly. But at the same time, is some individual, very privileged people are see themselves as environmentalists.
Yeah.
And like, and so what we see, there's this mismatch between what's happening like on the individual scale, but once 7 billion people are doing it, or 8 billion, it begins to be something different on the big scale.
Yeah, something I thought was really funny lately. If you're on Instagram at all, you see all these celebrities like advertising private planes. Yet And I didn't think about this until I started listening
Right.
to Greta Thunberg. She's a carbon emissions limit, and she
Excellent.
takes trains everywhere, and she's been invited all over the world, but she won't go because she's talking about how planes are contributing so much to climate change and pollution, and then she targeted private planes. And so then I was looking at some celebrities that were showing their recycling, their like non-plastic water bottles on a
On
private
the
plane.
right.
I'm thinking, well,
Yeah.
that one, if you use one plastic water bottle, it's maybe not as bad as the private plane that you're taking a couple times a week, even
Excellent.
if it's bad.
So you mentioned We're All One. So this is from a book in 1988 that I am familiar with. It's Joseph Campbell talking with Bill Moyers. And so let's say we get on Spaceship Earth, go out in space, and look back at the Earth. And it kind of picks up with this other image of Mother Earth that's also alive in the world today, or a more commonly used image is Mother Earth. So is it Spaceship Earth or Mother Earth? One's biological, one's technological. So Campbell mentions the whole planet as an organism. Bill Moore says, so Mother Earth, will new myths come from this image? Well, something might. You can't predict what a myth is going to be any more than you can predict what you're going to dream tonight. Myths come from realization of some kind that have found expression in symbolic form. And so with the environmental issues, we're trying to, there's an awareness or a realization. And a polar bear on the iceberg is like one image or whatever, but we're looking for, like, what's the symbolic form that could empower people? But Campbell in the 80s, the only myth that's going to be worth thinking about in the immediate future is one talking about the planet. Not the city, not these people, but the planet and everybody on it. That's my main thought for what the future myth is going to be. You see the ground of what the myth is to be, and it's already here. The eye of reason, not of my nationality, the eye of reason, not of my religious community, not my linguistic community. Do you see? And this would be the philosophy for the planet, not this group, that group, or another group. When you see the earth from the moon, you don't see any divisions. There are no nations or state. This might be the symbol really for the new mythology to come. That is, the country that we're going to be celebrating is the whole earth, and the people we are one with. And so this is a new awareness or realization that humanity's trying to come to terms with. I have this fantasy of asking students in a class, like, would you rather things work well on the local level or the global level? But what would happen, sometimes in order for things to work best at the global level, there's a terrible cost at the local. Or to make things work at the local level, things wouldn't work at the global level. And so this is why this quote of thinking on every scale begins to be really important. The current, like, politics is really about, are we going to organize as nations or organize as a globe?
As you were reading that from Joseph Campbell, though, you said the eye of reason, or reason. And I was thinking, that seems like something straightforward. But when I hear reason thrown around
Right.
and, like, there's not, like, black and white reason. Reason
Right.
is something different to...
Yes. So I'm glad
yeah.
you mentioned that. And that he was making another point. So there was a context for it.
Yeah.
But you caught on, I would not say it that way, of like kind of reason, or reason is not this simple answer.
And the reason why I thought about it is because we've been talking about climate change, and I see people say, well, be reasonable. The earth always goes through changes. That's just
Yes,
how it works.
because in the current world right now, reason is data, numbers.
But numbers and data point to something other than it's just how the earth naturally works.
Yes.
So that's what is reason anymore? I don't know. Something I argue about with like some of my friends or that have like a different mindset than me. Like the world is black and white logic, and it's between black and white and a world of gray. What do we live in?
And we've mentioned nearly every author we've looked at is not embedded in what's called the Enlightenment way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer to everything being reason is Enlightenment thinking. And that's why we're going, well, maybe that's not the whole answer.
Yeah,
It's a
so
certain kind. It's a Western European
yes, but that's how intelligence is
reason.
judged now by the Enlightenment thinkers. They're the ones that are seen as the intellectuals now, scientists,
Right.
which they are, but that's not it. I mean, Einstein, arguably,
Excellent.
like he was the one that said, you know, what was it like? You ask a fish like to climb a tree or something, and it'll seem something like that. It'll seem stupid. There's
Yes.
different types of
But
intelligence.
many environmentalists are turning toward tribalism or shamans or as having a piece of the puzzle that aren't using what many people would call reason. And yet they have a piece of the puzzle of perhaps what the future holds.
I think just spending time in nature, what does that inspire within you? Even the most reasonable people I know, enlightenment thinkers, if you go on a hike or something, they're not looking at like the science of everything around them. It's a feeling like the peace that instills within them more romantic feelings
Excellent.
when they're in nature.
I
So,
often tell people go out in nature and see how your brain feels.
yeah, I think some nature inherently like inspires romance. It's not we can learn about it.
Right.
That's important too, but there has to be a balance, and balance is the word that we need a word count for that.
The School of Life often makes fun of romantics for like talking about waterfalls a lot and for
Yeah.
valuing nature in this very way that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I was, again, before recording, I was saying environmentalists or hippies, there's always like, I mean, negative language surrounding it, tree huggers, dirty hippies. Like, it's not
Yes.
most positive language, or it's belittling, childlike, like calling them childlike.
Which romantics have a fondness for children or for
Yeah,
being childlike. It's valued different than being childish or something. It's
oh
being
yeah.
immature or
Yeah, so I'm reading, and this is something that will probably be in another podcast, another episode, reading Watchmen right now. And there's a part of it that's talking about how can study birds, and that's necessary, but if there's no poetry within the study of them, then it's kind of useless if there's nothing childlike within it. And I think writers especially, there's some writers that are just absolutely obsessed with their childhoods. And I don't think it's
yes.
about the events in the childhood, it's that the way of viewing the world that you just never get back, and you have to, if you do, you have to work for it.
I just flashed back my sixth grade elementary school teacher said that's what artists had some kind of attachment to their childhood. And somehow I still remember that now.
Yes. And I mean, it's that playfulness that artists naturally. What was I watching? I was watching an interview with some artist, and I'll link it if I can find it. But he was saying that, oh no, it's not an artist. It's a YouTuber, and his channel's Charisma on Command. And he was talking about some trip he had medicinally. And he said that the message that he received was that he lost all touch with his childhood and his playfulness. And that what he was thinking was, or the message he receives, that he doesn't do anything, he does something to improve. He never does anything to play. And that
Excellent.
stuck with me because I don't do anything to, like, even the things I love the most, like reading or writing or dancing or whatever, my mind is always, I have to do this to improve. This has to be something to improve my life, not for just the fun of it.
So last week when we were talking about convenience store woman, the idea, the real myth, story, narrative she undermines is that we've made this steady progress from Stone Age times till the present.
Mm-hmm.
And So got to improve myself as part of this idea of like kind of progress. Um, Going to this desire to like kind of do something good in the world that beginning around 2000 and maybe before and after 9/11, I began to see, it was notable, young people that wanted to make the world better, that were driven to that. Perhaps driven to have families, driven to have, in the past, the drives inside a person would be to have a family or to have a career or to have a family and career.
Yeah.
But the specific drive, and it would be a drive to work overseas. It was global in scope, and I think it has to do with the internet, made everyone more global minded. But it was a motivation inside people, especially in females.
And you said this was around 9/11 that you noticed this.
But even before it,
Yeah, because I was going to ask around, like, say, early, like, I don't know, any type of terrorist attack or wars,
yes.
if it would inspire the same thing.
Right. But there's this strange motivation in a lot of humans now to make the world better. So there's improve myself, but there's also to, like you also express, like somehow wanting to make the world better.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's when I don't know if it's really true, but it seems like it. I have flashbacks of elementary school being taught, like, to as you grow, that your goal should be to make the world a better place or to leave your mark on it, which doesn't necessarily mean to leave it a better place.
Yes.
So, yeah, there is that need to be, and that's a part of being useful. If you're not
Yes.
making something better, how are you being useful?
So talk about book sense. This is Blessed Unrest, how the largest movement in history happened and nobody saw it coming. And it was written before Occupy. And this author, a lot can be done with a metaphor. Metaphors are powerful. He said the Earth's immune system is kicking in.
Mm-hmm.
And he had worked with activists, people working for the environment, social justice, and indigenous people.
Oh, you know, it's really interesting. Who was it? Feels like Terence McKenna, but it might not be. And he was like going through this theory. It might not be Terence McKenna. Anyway, that humans like came to be what they are, as intelligent as we are, because of something like the Earth's immune system kicking in, realizing that there's going to be something catastrophic in the future, and maybe humans, like intelligent humans, will be here to help that.
Excellent. So now you're like, instead of captain on the spaceship, crew, it is now you're becoming crew of the spaceship and seeing how that could work.
Yeah, and I was kind of stuck on that, to be crew. I mean,
Right.
and what does that imply? And does it imply something useful? It also implies something connecting to last week about that there's not just one goal for everybody to be, like, not everybody can be, or should be
Excellent.
rich and famous, or not everybody should
Right.
be whatever. There's a place for
Right.
everybody.
And we even said
To
the
become-
convenience store woman had a very small footprint on the
Mhm.
earth. From one point of view, she is not harming anyone. She's not doing anything wrong, morally wrong.
You compared her to a monk?
Yeah, what if she, like, kind of,
But would she be crew?
couldn't she be?
I wonder, like, what would that place... I mean, yeah, that's a function. What she was doing, that's something that's useful for people. That's, like, she's doing something productive.
If you look with the lens of cause no harm,
Yeah.
she's really causing minimal harm as a human. But she was looked downcast, like kind of, she was like shunned because she's not living like one of these big stories. I got to make my mark.
Yeah. And what I was going to say is that to leave your mark, I mean, that you're leaving a mark. How can you put your voice out there? How can you be an activist? How can you do anything without causing some harm, even with the best intentions? Even working your hardest to only do good. That's the fear of being very ambitious.
Right? Yeah. So humanity is dealing, maybe in the same way as we begin to start dealing with limits in the 70s, we're beginning to deal with even the limits of what does good mean, or how to, like, it's not as straightforward and as simple. We're able to ask questions humans had never really asked before, but it's undermined our confidence. It's created a lot of paralysis in a way.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that I mentioned this on the very first episode, maybe the second, about the show The Good Place, and where they were it's about these people who've died and gone, supposedly to the good place. Then they figure out that actually no one's gotten into the good place for 500 years, not because the bad place is interfering, but because it's way too complicated to be good, and no one can possibly be good. You buy an apple at the store, and you're actually having negative points toward putting you towards the bad place because of the environmental, or the people that were employed weren't treated fairly. You're contributing to that by buying an apple.
Yes. So I'm 60 now. I grew up in the South in the 60s. There were a lot of things wrong with that. And yet I've often said children were raised not to be happy, not to be successful, but to be good. And good has always been defined by whatever culture you're in.
Hmm.
And for a long, long time, humanity's desire to be good was culturally defined.
There's still remnants of that.
Excellent.
I was talking to somebody, this woman from Vietnam. She was talking about how the way children treat their elders or young
Excellent.
people, and she said she has to respect her elders
Yes.
and
Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am.
yeah, and anything they ask of her, she must do. She said she was appalled when she moved to America at how young people treated their elders.
Right. Had open doors, had to, so there were rules.
Mm-hmm.
And then we begin to question the rules, or the rules begin to be seen in a different way, or to be seen as culturally embedded. And then when that process goes too far, then there's no morality. So what we're struggling is how to keep the good, but also there was a lot wrong in that culture. There was a lot of embedded kind of oppression, and so even ma'am, that became controversial. Everything became controversial.
I mean, being here in Noonan, sometimes when I'm at the grocery store, people say ma'am to me. And
Yes.
I'm just please don't call me that.
Right.
Not yet.
Right.
Maybe not ever.
Yes.
Yeah, but I was also thinking now in the younger generation, the young activists, there's a distrust of your elders. They're the ones that we often say, the baby boomers got us into this mess. We don't have jobs.
Yes.
They put
Right.
so much blame on us. But yeah, there's a lot of distrust of the older generations.
But in the 60s, the phrase was, don't trust anybody over 30.
Right? Yeah. That's really putting the bar for elders low.
Yeah, yeah. But it was a real feeling because
Yeah.
those elders had got us in this mess,
Mm-hmm.
which was pretty incredible on the other side. And the world's still that way. There are a lot of opportunities and gifts, and there's a lot of challenges and struggles. So that's our spaceship. Carl Jung, to bring in something I am more grounded in, kind of had this idea that your job as a crew member is to become yourself. So, and he even, there's an essay where he wrote about, nobody's ever changed the world. The world doesn't change. It's as good and as bad as it's always been.
Mm-hmm.
But your journey is as you become yourself on whatever scale and in whatever location you're in, that's the best thing you can do.
Yeah,
Wow.
I don't know what happened. Something reacted. And yeah, no, I agree with that. And until I started feeling more comfortable with myself, I didn't even have the ability to be like useful for anything or anybody else. But also, this is, if the spaceship is docked, there's time for the crew to find themselves. If the
Excellent.
spaceship is
Excellent.
out is in outer space and it's breaking down, if the crew is finding themselves, we're in trouble.
And there's no user's manual. So in the becoming yourself, it's not like you're going to know that ahead of time.
No. Again, when we were talking about last week, chasing your dreams, there's a privilege to that. There's a privilege to being able, and time. Like, even time is a privilege too, to figuring yourself out. You can't predict when that happens too, or when you start to. I was talking to a friend, we're both 26, and I said, I feel like I'm a little late to the game, figuring out like my tastes, my interests, and seeing how much of a parrot I am of all the things that I consume. He said, yeah, I feel the same way. Are we late to the game for figuring ourselves out, or is this just continual? There has to be time, and if you're always in like responsibility mode, working all the time, responsibility, or like, doing what you need to do to survive.
Right. So without a user's manual, you're learning by doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's this ongoing process that really, what's the right thing to do? I think it never ends. The good thing is, I think the better people struggle with themselves.
Yeah.
Maybe that's your moral obligation, is to just struggle with all of this and find your way.
And that's why we believe more in wholeness than happiness than anything. Because you might struggle to happiness. There's even like the objective of becoming happy, living happy. There's struggle like that you're putting yourself through just to figure out how to be happy all the time, and it's not a useful struggle, I'd say, maybe in retrospect.
The convenience store woman didn't really feel.
No. She didn't. She only struggled with her identity when people intervened. On her own, she was fine.
Because it made other people uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And they expressed it in different ways.
But anyone who's around people or has a family, that's going to be the case.
But I'm glad you mentioned wholeness. Carl Jung says the purpose of psychotherapy is not perfection, it's wholeness. And so I was thinking what we were trying to say earlier in this broadcast, like what we lose in perfection of this podcast, we're trying to gain in authenticity, spontaneity, but also to have a conversation where we don't know ahead of time exactly where it's going to go, because we're trying to capture perhaps saying something that we didn't know at the first, as we began the podcast.
Oh yeah, every time I think, because usually we talk for a couple hours before I even get started. I write up the information or a kind of a script, more just information a week ahead of time. But even still, it always veers off in a different direction than expected. And
I have, even though that's risky, I have faith in that, because we really are trying to find something that's actually alive, and perhaps to let people hear how a conversation about a book, about a passage in a book, can deepen or change your awareness of the world. And it can even happen like during our conversation for us.
Yes. Yeah. And again, we mentioned this before, some people are so, they're interested in the idea of books and what literature can do for them, but to read an entire book is so daunting. It's not always necessary.
So we're trying to take off some of the daunting or some of the intimidation, some of the you've got to be perfect or you've got to be academic or you've got to be any way in your approach to books.
Yes. Because even within the literary community, there's a hierarchy that's created.
That we're trying to subvert, obviously.
Yeah, for this, next week we have a song planned, and from a comic book, I think, when I was reading when I was younger, I read what I liked. I read horror. That was my main love. I read a little bit of popular fiction, teen fiction. When I got to college, I read nothing but literary fiction and literary journalism, things that I thought were loftier. It's only
Yes.
now that I've started to like find, and I find so much value in graphic novels. I'm learning so much, and I'm getting over that embarrassment. But it took me a long time to get past that embarrassment of showing
Getting
what
over
I
the
loved.
hierarchy.
Yeah, yeah, because and that's I think now there's like literary communities like Litsy. That's an app that everyone's sharing what they love, and that's. But if you go into college or something, you're not gonna be reading much Stephen King or unless you're in a specialized course or something. I was actually I loved Stephen King as a teenager, and then my professor like made fun of his writing and talked about how it was bad, and then I stopped reading him for a couple years.
So perhaps one of the most challenging thing we're facing on Spaceship Earth is our automatic forming of hierarchies and how that may not be helpful.
Hierarchies, and I mean, I don't have enough knowledge to even really explain this clearly, but I mean, hierarchies, they naturally form, like even in nature with animals, you know. But should we find a way, like out of our little pocket, having a hierarchy? Or that,
How to maximize the good and minimize the damage of some of these things that naturally form on our spaceship.
yeah. Or just like maybe hierarchy when it comes to people isn't the right word to use.
Excellent.
You know, there's like
There you go.
crew, like as McLuhan is
Excellent.
closer, because there's, and when I, even when I say a place for everyone, sometimes saying like putting you in your place, everyone has a place, is really
Excellent.
negative and
Yes.
demeaning, but it's not. It's, if you find
Finding
your
your
own,
place.
finding your place, and then everyone around you need to accept that place. Because I do think, and last week we brought up, Jim Carrey saying you need to follow your dreams, and we talked about that in this episode. And people were saying, but not everybody can be rich and famous. And then other people are like, somebody needs to be trapped.
Not
in
everybody
something.
can change the world. Not everybody can.
Yeah, but I was thinking, yeah, well, I wonder if everyone was just left to like following what they want to do. I wonder if it would all just kind of work out in the wash. Like, if it would all just kind of, if there was actually a place for everyone where there would be, the world would still work, or if everyone would go in one direction. I am inclined to think that it would all work out if everybody had room to explore.
So there's a possibility of heading toward utopia instead of oblivion.
Yeah, and that's something I was writing a story about utopia actually, because I was struggling with the idea of a utopia, thinking maybe we need to rethink utopia. I mean, utopia, where did that form exactly, or the thought? I'm most familiar with it in literature, writers forming the idea of a utopia. Same with like happiness. Let's put those on the same level. There's not a lot of complexity there.
Right.
There's still complexity in utopia.
So Thomas More wrote Utopia awaiting his execution in prison. So there's where utopia came from. And
Awaiting his
there's,
execution.
yes, absolutely hopeless. But another writer said, but writers always have the last word.
Mm-hmm.
So even in awaiting his personal execution, he wrote, wouldn't it be good if society operated this way? A utopia.
If you were to create a story about a utopia, would it be interesting? There's all these dystopian, there's Divergent, there's The Hunger Games, there's
Right.
just about anything you can think of. Would a movie about a utopia be interesting? There must be.
They're political theorists. After World War II, it's not accidental that utopia faded out. Both communism and fascism, political leaders presented a utopia, like gained their political power by creating and using this idea of utopia. So now there's almost a revulsion toward somewhere there's a totalitarian system behind every utopia.
Yeah. I mean, any type of news and media makes you think that we're about 2 steps away from entering like an apocalypse, a dystopia.
Yes.
Like,
Right.
You can't escape from it.
And yet, like, I think what we're talking about, you can't live without hope either.
Yeah.
But maybe it's small hopes, not a big a postmodern phrase is like no grand narratives. So when one small group of people figures out their utopia and tries to enforce that on the whole world, that's totalitarian. Yeah,
Totalitarianism.
see?
It's almost
Right?
yeah.
Right?
Or it always seems to. So I've also, in the past few years, been thinking a lot about like cults and how there's always a positive start, always like an optimistic vision when a cult
Excellent.
begins.
So religious utopias.
Yeah,
And people have been burned by those.
yeah, but
So we're very gun shy. Go ahead.
oh no, I was I'm listening to you. That was pretty much what I had to say. It always starts off as positive, but then it devolves into something darker than you could have imagined. Is like, why does it happen? Is it because the people that start it, like Manson or anybody that starts cults, have an idea of what like society would like, what would be healthier for a group or whatever, but it's just the wrong people enacting this for egotistical
Maybe it has
gains.
to do with the ends justify the means being this terrible slippery slope. What is the leader supposed to, like, kind of how far are they willing to go to create their version of the utopia? And really, especially with cults, how much feedback do they give to everybody else? Like, is this working for you?
It's true. There's a leader. There's not a community.
Mm-hmm.
Really, followers.
Right?
Followers.
One of the reasons I got excited about Occupy is on purpose they didn't have leaders. That was pretty innovative. Pretty foolish, folly from one point of view. But it wasn't an accident. It wasn't like nobody volunteered for the job. They saw there was this intrinsic flaw to a certain kind of leadership. And they even had a phrase like leadership is a role, not a privilege or not a position.
And even with, say, like advertising, I think it's a mistake to put like one person as the face of a brand or the face of anything. That's making it more about the person than the message. You know, and if the person falls, then the message loses validity.
That's something that we've learned that humanity is kind of learning.
But how does that work then?
Crew's got to figure it
Responsibility?
out. Yeah. So with the internet world crowdsourcing, there have been some amazing accomplishments with crowdsourcing.
Yeah, I mean, that's how a lot of people get their health care, you know, from crowdsourcing or their, like what we're doing, fun streams and careers. So at the beginning, you said that McLuhan is thought of as a visionary.
And that we would get back to that.
Yes. God knows how long later we've gotten back to it. But so it made me think about visionaries. Can we train ourselves to think like a visionary? Or is it just some special people are born as visionary? I think there's some training that we can do or perceive.
Although book sense is about using books as a sensory organ,
Yes.
and
Training
you just
our
mentioned perception, and there was you had this question: is training our perception the most important part of understanding and envisioning anything? How can we train it? McLuhan credits his educators for training his perception.
And I wanted to get in more into that. Was off of Wikipedia as well, and I wanted to get into more of that. I'd have to read a biography or something, because that's a little vague. How did they train his perception? Because without that, he probably wouldn't have been the visionary that he is. Is it all about education?
So perception has something to do with vision and visionary. Yes.
Yeah.
And very few people talk about it. There's one branch of psychology called Gestalt therapy that actually looks at our perceptions. But I call it a consciousness box. If kind of what consciousness is thoughts, feelings, action or behavior, and perceptions. And we think of those as different things, but they actually all kind of happen interacting with each other at the same time. And very few people ever mention perception or even think about perception.
It's hard to. I mean, it's hard to have a like, I'm so steeped in my culture, my lifestyle, like, what's surrounding me. I feel like the only way I could train my perception differently is by stepping outside of everything.
Excellent.
We've mentioned the term, like, falling out of culture.
Yes. So culture is, what if that was the perceptual organ for people until the internet?
Yeah, and then that just causes
Not
disruption.
because it's an alternative, but because there are multiple cultures
No, there's
simultaneously.
exposure to every type of culture, every type of personality.
Right.
It's endless.
Right. So Spaceship Earth is consciousness. Everybody alive today is really living in a situation humans have never been in, where we're not embedded in one culture at a time. And the crew is trying to adjust.
Without
And
a
the stakes
manual.
are high. It can be oblivion or utopia.
Yeah,
The stakes are really high.
and we're all feeling it. I don't know if this is just an, like,
But we couldn't put our
state.
finger on what it is that's
No.
so different. But culture did teach you how to perceive. Carlos Castaneda, Don Juan, said, when you're born, the old ones begin describing the world to you. And you're given membership in that culture to the extent you accept the definitions. That's culture. But that's also perception. But the shamans, like, they worked with people's perceptions. This show, we're working with people's perceptions. You mentioned the book Jim Crow and how it changed, like, a perception you had out in the
Yes.
world.
Without even thinking about exactly what the message was. I said on the way here, like, if something happened, I saw on the side of the road, didn't think so much of the book, my body had a reaction to it. I felt chills run up.
And it was a book about oppression and...
Yeah, it's about how the prison system is the new Jim Crow.
And so you read the book, and it's back here in your mind somehow. But then as you're driving down the road, you see an event. Nothing's different about, like, what you can see, but you see more in it, and get a response.
Yeah.
I mean, a body response.
I kind of slowed down to see, like, what was going on. I felt like, all right, it's not my place to step in, but is it, too, if they were being mistreated? Because it was young kids, the
Right.
cops.
So slowing down to say, I'm watching you.
Yeah, no, that's kind of, like, what I was thinking. And I wonder if, like, 10 years ago, if I was driving by, would I have just assumed that they must have done something wrong to be pulled over and being, like, searched like they were?
So I think that's a great example of book sense. How your awareness was, like, it's now different.
There's a quote that I can't remember who said it, and I don't know exactly how it says, but it's like, I don't remember the books I've read, but even still, they've made me.
Excellent.
Something like that. And yeah, that's how I think about it, because sometimes I'm going through a book that, I read and loved, and I can't remember a lot of the content there, but even still, I'm a product of that book in some little way or significant way. Product.
Yeah. So in some sense, a visionary, only the future will know who the visionaries were. There's this kind of looking back in calling someone a visionary. It's almost like you have to live into the future to know who was a visionary and who was crazy. Like,
Yeah. Although I do sometimes see current artists, even young artists, being described as visionaries just because it's something that just seems so new.
Excellent.
And also that's education there, because there's sometimes, like, I've seen artists described as visionaries, and say I'm looking at a YouTube video about, like, I don't know, David Bowie, for example. I'll go down and I'll see comments saying, well, he was inspired by this person, he took a little bit of this person, and then you think, wait, is it just because they knew how to like mold everything together in a seemingly brand new way?
And often the creator is not aware they're even doing that. It's as all of these influences form you,
Yeah.
right? So visionary all the way back to cave painting has always, in a way, been the role of artists or of creative people. They're kind of saying, listen to this, look at this. So there we have the contrast between kind of common sense, but artists are kind of working with common sense to accent certain things, take other things out of you. And I think the real test is like, does it work for you? Is the world now a richer place? Is the world now a more understandable place? Are you more on your path?
And immediately my mind goes to something negative. That's awful. Because I was thinking, all right, so some of the, for example, the school shooters. We're watching the 90s, they were talking about Columbine. And many of the people that like carry out these terrorist attacks, they have this like grand vision, something they were inspired by something really negative
Excellent
or awful.
point. Yes. So there is, how far are you willing, what are you willing to do to other people to enact your vision? That is horrible. And so the challenge is, or there's, to always have kind of this guardrail of, is this vision I'm working on, what possible harm could it do?
And who is,
And am I willing to harm in order to accomplish my goal or my mission?
and also, is it serving only me?
Excellent.
Is it serving me and others?
The earth, humanity.
Yeah. Or you can take that down to a very like a relationship level. When you're in a relationship, by saying this to my spouse or to my partner, is this serving me, or is it like because it'll hurt their feelings, or will it help both of us?
So there's a
Or
great
friendship?
filter no matter what scale you're working on. And maybe that's the big moral question. As we all try to meet our needs, but at what cost to other people and the planet? This is how we see Book Sense. Gale and I are crew, so are you. We hope for your contributions, perspectives, and conversations to build Book Sense and make it better and better. Until next time,